Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a fortnight ago that, whilst travelling westwards from London to Bath, fatigued and in need of refreshment, I stopped the carriage at the hamlet of Speenhamland, near Newbury, Berkshire, there to patronise the inn, the Ruddy Duck. Not 30 minutes later I found myself most fortunate to partake of a fine leg of lamb exquisitely prepared by an émigré Frenchwoman, of deserved local repute for the high state of her culinary artistry. As I partook, I could hardly help but overhear a conversation at a nearby table between two magistrates, themselves enjoying her delectable fillet of sole and roast pheasant. Given the evident passion of the participants, their dialogue easily reached my ears, and I gathered that these magistrates lamented the recent severe rise in grain prices, and with it the cost of bread, with marked effects on the poor. The proposed solution of one was to give an automatic grant of money to those falling below a certain income, the solution of the other to do nothing. By and by, the gentlemen, continuing to disagree, surveyed the dining hall and, seeing me as if for the first time, excused their loud tones. But I requested them to join me, mentioning that the subject interested me too. They acceded to my request, I taking another bite of the lamb along with a spoonful of potatoes grand mère, otherwise known as creamy scallop potatoes, made the following comment. "Gentlemen," I said, "whilst the rise in bread prices is indeed unfortunate, your answer, whatever it may be, cannot lie in the provisioning of the poor by directly opening the state's purse. Certainly individual charity may help, but if a law is enacted granting automatic parish payments, this will result in many of the poor and others as well taking undue advantage by adjusting their behavior accordingly. Employers, for example, who know that those earning a low wage will receive an automatic public subsidy, will offer a lower wage deliberately, understanding the parish will supply the difference. And landlords, too, will adjust their behavior, increasing rents, since they know the parish will thereby grant part of the rent money. This effect, however, would not occur under the more discriminatory or discriminating regime of private charity. No, this proposed law of automatic parish relief can only have consequences contrary to the very effects you wish to achieve." Pausing to take another bite of lamb and soon a forkful of our Frenchwoman's delectable carrot soufflé, I added, "I would suggest instead, as hard as it sounds, to only give public benefits through the workhouse itself. This would alleviate most of the above-mentioned difficulties, as well as eliminating the need for much taxpayer support. You must also remember that whenever you tax the population to give out charity through parish officials, you reduce the variability of the citizenry as private individuals to give out their own monies, since they now have less. The question then becomes, who precisely can judge genuine cases of charity better, a private person or the state?" The two magistrates, after some further discussion, thanked me and returned to their own table, conversing subsequently in more moderate tones. Now, if we turn instead to those concerned with the plight of the poor in your own 21st century, we find just such a person in one-time banker, author, and long-time Spectator, Telegraph, and Daily Mail journalist James Bartholomew. In The Welfare State We're In, our author comprehensively describes and explains the history, nature, and destructive consequences of Britain's adoption of various aspects of the welfare state, past and present. James begins by posing 26 questions to test our own knowledge of the subject. Among these are, number 2, in the mid-19th century, before state schooling was introduced, how many children had 5 to 7 years education? 95%. Number 5, after many decades of state education, what is now the rate of functional illiteracy among adults? 25%. Number 8, penicillin was probably Britain's greatest contribution to world medicine in the 20th century. Who funded the research that led to it? Primarily private philanthropic institutions. Number 9, how many of London's famous teaching hospitals were funded by the NHS? 0. Number 11, how many people a year die in Britain because the NHS's treatment of cancer is inferior to the average of other advanced European countries? 10,000. And that was in 2003. Number 14, how many of the 7 million men working in industry in 1892 were members of a friendly society, which was a cooperative mutual insurance company? Answer, 6 million. And number 22, how many more violent crimes took place in 2002-3 compared to 1898? Answer, 128 times more. His pop quiz finished, our author proceeds to cover 5 main policy areas: Social Security, the NHS, education, housing, and pensions, and interspersed throughout describes the horrendous consequences of each. Let's survey the wreckage in each category. Category number 1, Social Security. One might think that the welfare state arose after World War II with the Labour Party and Clement Attlee, but our author says, think again. It really originated when Henry VIII raised his digitus imputicus to the Pope. Among other actions, he confiscated the wealth of many monasteries, ensuring that the provisioning of welfare for the poor and care for the aged, which the monasteries had previously supplied, was devastated. As a result, Henry subsequently devised various makeshifts to attempt to ensure the communities helped the indigent. When his mildest solutions failed, he instead decreed that idlers and wanderers should have a V branded on their chests and be enslaved for 2 years. And if they ran away and were caught again, they should be branded with an S on their foreheads or cheeks and enslaved forever. As James summarizes, thus began a cycle in the story of welfare that has continued from the 16th century right up to now, with alternations of mild then harsh treatment. At the end of one of these laxer periods in 1834, a royal commission composed of numerous eminent citizens produced a report on the current state of welfare services, documenting that the combination of aid liberally given through the offices of the state resulted in many cases like a pauper threatening to abandon his wife and family unless more money is allowed him, threatening to abandon an aged, bedridden mother, to turn her out of his house and lay her down at the overseer's door unless he is paid for giving her shelter. Another commission member reported moral character is annihilated, and the poor man of 20 years ago who tried to earn his money and was thankful for it is now converted into an insolent, discontented, surly, thoughtless pauper who talks of right and income, which, incidentally, is the exact same attitude that many welfare recipients hold today. Yet another of these commission members reported, if an industrious man from a poor family was known to have laid by any part of his wages, and thus to have accumulated any considerable sum, there are some parishes in which he would be refused work till savings were gone. And the knowledge that this would be the case acts as a preventative against saving. Again, this finds a direct parallel in modern times, with Bartholomew highlighting the famous case of James Stent, who in 1994,
winning £31,000 in bingo, deliberately spent all the money because he thought that his disability checks were means tested. But they weren't. And his wife, who had cerebral palsy, screamed in anguish when she learned that. The Victorian era, in which welfare was not much given by the state, was distinguished instead by their enormous private generosity, with the Times in 1885 reporting that the combined incomes of London charities came to more than the revenues of several European governments. Bartholomew adds that the charitable giving of modern Britain is a pinprick compared to that of the Victorians, who gave up to 10% of their incomes. Modern Britons give less than 1%. So we see that when the state increases its giving, the private sector naturally decreases it. Some final notes on welfare. A. It obviously creates higher levels of persistent unemployment, in modern times much higher than it existed in Britain previously. For example, in 2002, researchers at Sheffield Hallam University estimated that half of those on sickness benefits should be described as hidden unemployed. So with 1.5 million on incapacity benefit in 2003, 750,000 were really unemployed. B. The mental state of those choosing to excuse themselves from gainful employment turns out to be irritated, depressed, and sometimes suicidal. As Bartholomew says, attempted suicide is 10 times more common among the jobless than those in work. Or we just get the following attitude. I used to be a really good-tempered chap, but while on the dole, someone just says something I don't like and I'll have a good go to give them a fat lip. Now let's move to rec number 2, the NHS. A few bullet points here should contrast it with the brilliance of English private hospitals previously. Number 1. St. Bartholomew's was perhaps the prototypical example, founded in the 12th century and surviving through Old Coppernose's destructive war on the church. William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, was the chief physician from 1609 to 1633. Medical students were first recorded in 1662. Funding for the hospital continued to come from old endowments and new gifts and legacies. It was, in effect, a charitable hospital for the benefit of the poor. There were no pay beds at all. By the middle of the 20th century, Bart's had become one of the best regarded and most famous medical schools in the world. Number 2. The wealth brought by the Industrial Revolution, along with the improvements in medical knowledge, led to an enormous increase in the number of hospitals. Out of the 550 or so hospitals for infectious diseases in the provinces in 1906, more than 400 had been founded since 1850. Number 3. An average physician at a charitable hospital when beginning his career went to work at the hospital in the morning, all for free. Then he took private patients between 2 and 5 in the afternoon. This wasn't unusual at all. Charitable hospitals often charge patients a sliding fee based on what they could pay. This was, overall, a viable system of funding. As Bartholomew says, the proportion of charitable hospital income coming from paying patients was rising dramatically. It jumped from 9% in 1891 to 52% in 1938, and very probably more in 1948. Number 4, how did patients pay? A small number of people paid cash when they needed a doctor, but the great majority made regular payments in various ways. Many, well over half the population, would pay for their GP through membership of a friendly society. Number 5, before the NHS, what was the state of British medicine? As Bartholomew summarizes, hospitals and beds were plentiful. Britain was a leader in a wide variety of specialties. A great richness of hospital existed in 1948. There were world leaders and world teachers. Most people were charged. They often made regular contributions of one sort or another so that if they needed hospital treatment, it would not be a catastrophic financial blow. 6. Then came nationalization in 1946. In the long term, it rivaled the destruction wrought by Henry VIII over 4 centuries earlier. The NHS presently, A, employs more than 4 times as many managers and support staff per nurse than a private hospital. B, has no program of screening for prostate cancer. 92% of people diagnosed with prostate cancer survive for another 5 years or more in the USA, whereas in Britain only 49% survive as long. C, a woman diagnosed with breast cancer in Britain was 40% more likely to die within 5 years than one living in France. Breast cancer screening is offered every 3 years to women aged between 50 and 70. Then the offer stops. D, regarding heart disease. British surgeons performed open-heart surgery 645 times for every million people, compared with 907 times in Switzerland, 904 in the Netherlands, 1,061 in Sweden, and 1,191 in Germany. Angioplasty was used for a mere 1% of those who had suffered a heart attack, compared with 19% of French and German heart attack victims. The Bristol Royal Infirmary's own chief of cardiothoracic surgery, Franco Ciulli, became so angry and disillusioned, he publicly announced that 15 people on his waiting list for surgery had died. He and his team revealed there was a 16-month waiting list compared to 2 months in France and Germany. E, regarding NHS hygiene. As one Zimbabwean nurse said in 2003, "I thought I was coming to first world nursing. I could not believe it because even the mission hospitals in Zimbabwe were cleaner and better run." F, because so many hospitals have been closed by the NHS, Britain now is one of the lowest numbers of beds per person of any advanced country. Japan has the most with 16.5 per 1,000 people. Germany has 9.3, Australia 8.5, and France 8.1. Britain is a mere 4.2. To depress ourselves further, let's examine public education, rec number 3. Just as the governmental NHS replaced the highly competent private medical system, so too in education. Let's have some of the more egregious bullet points. Number 1. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, education in the 19th century too, like healthcare, was reaching an ever greater proportion of the population. It rose from 7% in 1818 to 13% in 1858, a near doubling in 40 years. And as alluded to in the pop quiz, pupils with 5 to 7 years schooling were 95% of the population by 1870. Number 2. Education not only reached more young people by, for example, the over 700 ragged schools subsidized by Lord Shaftesbury, but also more adults with the creation of mechanic schools by John Anderson, who found the men so intelligent and eager to learn that he started lectures solely for persons engaged in the practical exercise of the mechanical arts. Number 3. In the same way that the introduction of the NHS resulted in a massive appropriation and destruction of private property in a country founded on the respect for property rights, so too the state increasingly, and over several generations, took over assets built up over years by charitable and private schools. The local boards of education, funded by rates, gradually destroyed independent schooling by offering a free alternative. Only independent schooling for the rich survived this competition. Number 4. In 1944, the state extended its control over church schools. In 1961, it created the first governmental college and increasingly subsidized older universities like Oxford and Cambridge. Isn't it interesting that political correctness and wokeness has arisen in Britain just as the government has controlled education more and more from the 60s on? Just as happened in America too? Overall, the present unprecedented degree of governmental control means that governments now tell universities how many students they may take in certain subjects, how they should choose which students to admit, whether tuition fees should or should not be charged, and how much lecturers may be paid. Number 5. So how shall we evaluate the modern British system? A. By 1990, Zulu children could spell English words better than British children. B. Given that the state tries to enforce educational standards by testing for children's competence in reading and math, what the public schools end up doing is simply teaching to that test. As Bartholomew says, many primary schools virtually stop teaching in the normal way for 10 weeks before the tests. Instead, day after day, they work through previous tests and practice papers. They manage to create the illusion of literacy rather than the thing itself. C. Grade inflation, as well as cheating from the internet and doing assignments, abound. So much that foreign countries like Singapore only accept diplomas from a limited number of British universities. The Singaporeans recognize low quality when they see it. D. Even Oxford and Cambridge are likely sliding. Oxford has only ever had one winner of a Nobel Prize in economics, whereas Chicago University has won 9 over the last 30 years. E. It's a common occurrence in English grammar public schools, especially whenever the last year of schooling is, for boys to engage in severe criminal behavior. So, for example, the police and education welfare officers once did a sweep for truants in East London, taking the children back to their schools. This resulted in a 39% drop in burglaries. F. For many children, it actually becomes quite rational not to attend school, given how violent it is and how little they learn. As one mother said, "Can I remember a time when Carl was not bullied? Only since we buried him." Not surprisingly, many teachers do not want to teach, since their administrations, as occurs in American public schools as well, increasingly won't control or punish misbehavior. One teacher commented, "Almost daily, I suffer abusive behavior, foul language, personal insults, and comments of a sexual nature too disgusting to repeat. When I first walk into a classroom, it is not unusual to be greeted with a comment, 'Just another effing supply teacher.'" G. Bartholomew believes there is no, or perhaps a negative correlation between funding for public education and the wealth and productivity of a country. Negative. So, for example, Hong Kong has rather lagged behind in its public spending on education, but it is now richer per capita than Britain. The economist Richard Vedder, I would note, has found this effect for higher education in various American states as well. And as I've stated it on this channel, it's my understanding that public education is not a public good, like the police or fire departments, but a public bad, which always results in a net educational loss. Private education, dollar for dollar, is always better. H. It's not surprising then that overall study after study around the world shows private schools to be better. As Bartholomew says, did any state school at all get into the top 30 schools in the country, ranked by A-level performance? No. In the first 50 schools in the country, a mere 4 were state schools. Out of the top 100, only 12 were state schools. So shall we move to wreckage number 4, governmental housing? And to conclude, number 5, government pensions? Number 4, governmental housing. Number 1, a study of Bethnal Green found that what slum clearance did was simply to destroy lower-class communities by destroying their network of extended families. Number 2, council tower block housing also proved a catastrophe, with violent, unpleasant neighborhoods the result. Partly this type of housing was so unsuccessful because its design prevented neighborhoods from protecting themselves easily against criminals, and also because the communities were so large, no one felt a part of them. As similar housing projects in the U.S. were demolished So too in Britain, beginning with Birkenhead in 1979. And finally, state pensions. Number 1. Should we really expect anything better here from big government? In America, the Social Security Trust Fund, now that's falsehood in advertising if you've ever heard it, is famously going bankrupt, with insolvency predicted to arrive in 2033. It's proving to be yet another indication of the vast social disaster that was the administration of that champion of big government, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In England, state pensions have been reduced to only 13% of average earnings for full-time employees. Number 2. The pension system, among many deficiencies, damages the willingness of people to save because it's means-tested. How much of you or have saved should, of course, be entirely irrelevant. If you put your own money in, you should get it out in the end, regardless of how much you've saved. But if you're getting other people's money out instead, then that's part of the problem, because no one in the system is then incentivized to save. As Bartholomew summarizes, successive governments have created an anti-saving culture. They have made saving into a mug's game for those on lower incomes. If we look at Hong Kong, for a long time, they had no state pension, and now only have a small one. And their general savings rate, 34%. The English saving rate, 17%. In conclusion, this is a magnificent book. I would give it an A. Why is it so good? First, partly because Bartholomew is a longtime journalist and knows well how to write appealing copy. Lots of facts, stats, personal stories, sidebars, which all add up to make it both engaging and highly informative. Secondly, he understands the importance of history. And so, describing Britain's brilliant past in all these areas, he can contrast that with the present, directly demonstrating what the solutions are. The elimination of all these governmental agencies that have so harmed the country. Very thankful for my part that I was privately educated, that I have St. Bart's available to me at any hour of the day or night, that aside from my sometimes too extensive book collection, I've been highly motivated to save throughout my lifetime, and finally that, as I head into my dotage, I have in Marguerite the most attractive caregiver and nurse any man could ever hope to possess. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.